Good to see you all. Thank you for being here for a Sunday night session. I think this is our 5th one, so those who have kept coming, thank you. God bless you. Appreciate it. Tonight, before I go to tonight, let's talk about the future. So we have 3 more Sunday night sessions. The next one will be November 12th. That one will be Melina Smith, who's the creator of Storymakers, which is the Sunday school curriculum that we use, which is a wonderful sort of like arts and gospel-based Sunday school curriculum. She's really interesting, creative, serious Christian. And so you can get some insight into what our kids are learning, but also what she's going to present on is Gen Z, Alpha, and the future of the church. So it's a question that all of us are sort of asking, right? Like, how are we going to transmit our Christian faith and tradition to kids in this very different context we're living in? So I think that's going to be really interesting. Then next is Dave Zoll, who runs Mockingbird Ministries and has written a wonderful book, so he will be a great presenter. And then finally, Tara Isabella Burton, who's a really interesting writer, writing about sort of the history of how we've come to this modern understanding of the self, of like how do we get to imagine ourselves as these individual autonomous humans instead of humans in relation. So she gives a sort of popular history of how we came to that realization. So got a lot of great stuff. So I hope you do keep coming back. But tonight we have a friend of mine. We both went to Nashotah House Seminary at different slight overlaps, and then have had some mutual friends through a while. But I've known about Tripp for a while. He served as an Anglican priest and pastor for a number of years, and now works for Dwell, which is an app that helps people listen to the Bible. He'll probably tell us a little bit about it. And so he's got this wonderful and interesting intersection of a traditional spirituality, also with trying to reckon with the age that we live in. So I'm looking forward to this presentation. And Dr. Tripp, I'm going to hand it over to you, good sir. All right.
Tour. Oh, thank you. You told me to turn it on and I didn't.
That's all right. I forgot to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My little Christian school English teacher said, "Let's go down and walk the riverfront," and that was the night I became a man. I'll spare you the details, but I have a memory of Savannah burned in my mind, and I say that to say some 30-odd years later or whatever, it's nice to remedy that and have a different experience of Savannah. So it's wonderful. I've been watching from a distance this series. My goodness, this is amazing. What a treat you guys have had. Father James from the band Luxury is a hero of mine from when I was in middle and high school. Luxury was my favorite band I'd ever heard. So that was really neat to hear that he was here. Harrison Scott Key, my goodness, amazing. It's incredible. The guest you've had here last time was the Hip Hop Apocalypse, which is awesome. Tonight we're talking about Christian prayer habits in England in the 17th century, which is about as opposite of hip hop as you can possibly find, and yet hopefully still beneficial. Father Jameson asked me to speak on prayer, which was the subject of my research at Nashotah House. I did a doctorate there and explored the themes of prayer and especially the renewal of the daily office, the way in which we can live a rhythm of faith with the daily office. So that's what I want to talk about. Before I dive in, I thought it'd be only fair to introduce you to my family. I put a photo here. This is my family and I. We live in Atlanta, just north of Atlanta, near Alpharetta, a little town called Cumming. This is my wife, Rachel. We got married when we were 20 years old. Our parents were crazy enough to let us do so, and it's been wonderful. We've been married for some time now. We have 3 children. Lillian, who just started high school. Emmeline, who is 12 in 6th grade, and our son Charlie, who is in 4th grade. Like Father Jameson said, I spent about a decade as an Anglican priest. I studied for ministry at a parish quite similar to St. John's, actually, also named St. John's in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was a prayer book parish. I was a part of the Prayer Book Society in Canada and really came to love and appreciate the rhythms of faith that came from this prayer tradition. And so studied there, and I served parishes in Florida as well as Texas before moving back home to Georgia. When the pandemic hit, my family and I imagine, as was the case for many of us, you kind of reevaluate and reassess some things and decide where your story's going. And so at that point, some friends of mine that had served or were in the parish I served in Texas, they had founded this app, the Dwell Bible app, and they said, would you consider coming on and kind of helping us give some pastoral and theological shape to this app we're building? And seemed like an exciting opportunity, so I said yes to that. At the same time, my family, we moved to a home in the countryside, and the closest church to us was a little Eastern Orthodox church. And so we, for the last 3 years, have also now been in the Orthodox tradition. And so you'll get it, like Father Jameson said, a bit of an interesting perspective on prayer tonight, because I'm going to draw on a long heritage and appreciation for prayer book spirituality, but also now living in a digital space. What does it mean to be Christians in the digital age? And how do digital tools both help and potentially hurt us in that pursuit? And then also a bit of an Eastern perspective in our recent years in the Orthodox Church. And all of that in 35 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop talking and dive in here. Let's start with a quote. Brother Lawrence, a name who likely is known to many of us, says this: "The most holy and important practice in the spiritual life is the presence of God. That is, every moment to take great pleasure that God is with you." And so to talk about prayer, to talk about attentiveness, the goal tonight is that more than when you walked in, you would be mindful of the presence of God in your life and have a few tools, a few practical ways in which you can cultivate a mindfulness, that you can not just think it would be nice to be mindful of God, to be aware of his presence, but to actually know how to remember God. This doesn't happen by accident. This is a hard thing. It's a hard thing to remember God, and yet it is the call before us. And I want to look especially to some examples from the past to show you a few people who've done this quite well, people who have in their own day been attentive to the presence of God, and show how we can do the same. So, remember God. It's fun when you put a question mark. It's like, remember God? Which feels very modern. That's like our secular age in a nutshell, right? Remember God? Remember when people were into him? I'm drawing on Psalm 77, where David speaks of remembering God. When I remember God in the night, he says. This is our aim, to remember God. And I would just say this. It is easier than we think to live entirely distant and unaware of God's presence in our midst. It's entirely easy, Christian and non-Christian alike. And to help frame that for us, I want to read a fairly long quote. I split it into many slides, so it's easy to follow along. But it's really helpful, by an English Orthodox bishop named Anthony Bloom, who wrote probably the best book on prayer I've ever read, called Beginning to Pray. And he talks about this inattentiveness, this way in which we simply do not remember God. And so it's the longest one of the night, but let's read it because I think it'll help frame where we're headed. Bloom says this: "It is very important to remember that prayer is an encounter and a relationship which is deep. And this relationship cannot be forced either on us or on God. The fact that God can make himself present or can leave us with the sense of his absence is part of this live and real relationship. If we could mechanically draw him into an encounter, force him to meet us simply because we have chosen this moment to meet him, there would be no relationship and no encounter. We can do that with an image, with the imagination, or with the various idols we can put in front of us instead of God. We can do nothing of the sort with the living God any more than we can do it with a living person. A relationship must begin and develop in mutual freedom. If you look at the relationship in terms of mutual relationship, you will see that God could complain about us a great deal more than we about him. We complain that he does not make himself present to us for the few minutes we reserve for him, but what about the 23.5 hours during which God may be knocking at our door and we answer, I am busy, I am sorry, or when we do not answer at all because we do not even hear the knock at the door of our heart, of our minds, of our conscience, of our life. So there is a situation in which we have no right to complain of the absence of God, because we are a great deal more absent than he ever is. Those are hard words to open with, and yet I think they describe the situation in which we find ourselves so much of the time. I'm not going to talk about God's absence. It's way above my pay grade. Save those questions for Father Jameson. But I can talk about our absence, our own inattentiveness, because that's the thing we can change. That's the thing that is within our power to address and to deal with. How are we attentive to God rather than simply being absent-minded, where we just don't pay attention? Like he's saying, we complain that God's not around or we don't hear from God, and yet are we actually listening? Are we aware of him? It reminds me of a line in the Brothers Karamazov where Fyodor Pavlovich says, we here in this family are unbelievers out of carelessness. That's his line. We're unbelievers out of carelessness. It's not a hardened, rational atheism. We just are careless. And I hate reading that line because it rings so true that we're careless so often in our life of prayer. And so, how do we remember God? How do we live a life of prayer that helps us remember him? I want to talk about two kinds of memory, two kinds of remembrance tonight. Cataclysmic remembrance and cultivated remembrance. Cataclysmic remembrance and cultivated remembrance. There's probably better ways to phrase it, but the alliteration was there, and so I went with it. Cataclysmic remembrance and cultivated. These are two different ways we remember things, not just God, but life itself, the ways in which we have memory of the events of our life, both good and bad. Cataclysmic remembrance, I would argue, is the default posture of the average American, and probably for most of us, the default posture for you and for me. This is a bit of a rabbit hole. I won't go too far down it, but you should on your own time. Look up a man named Christian Smith. Christian Smith is a sociologist, philosopher at Notre Dame. And he's done a series of books that looked at the religious lives and habits of American youth, starting when I was relatively young, so kind of my generation, people who are now approaching in or around 40 years old. And for about 20 years, he studied the same people for about 20 years, for about 2,000 to 3,000 people. He tracked these youth and tried to say, what is the default religious posture? What are the religious habits and practices of American youth? And he gave it a name, and you've probably heard this name, but it's helpful for us as we dive into this. He didn't call it Christianity. He called it something else. He called it moralistic therapeutic deism. You've probably heard this, but it's an important, and if you haven't, you should sit with it, because he says, by and large, this is the default religious posture of America's youth. And he said this of youth who are now pushing middle age. And so you really could say this is the default American religion. This is the religion in America. Briefly, moralistic. Most people think God wants me to be good more than he wants me to be bad. If I'm good, God will be happy with me. The more good I am, the more God likes me. And so when I think of God, if I remember him, he wants me to be moral, generally moral, be kind, be a nice, good citizen. Therapeutic. Not only does he want me to be good, but God also is kind of like my divine therapist and is there to comfort me in my times of trial. He's there to guide me into a better version of myself. So God's available for that, but mostly he's distant and uninvolved in the stuff of my life. This the deism. This is Thomas Jefferson's religion. This is the God who wound up the world like a watchmaker, set it off and let it go. Does not intervene. I don't want him to intervene, the average American would say. Don't get involved in the stuff of my life. I like it just how it is, unless there's a crisis. Unless there's a cataclysmic event where I need you to intervene, swoop in, fix my problem, and then swoop out as quickly as you can. That's the default American posture when it comes to religion. And there's something interesting here with this, tied to this theme of remembrance, because it's very closely related. We don't have a memory of God often, until something cataclysmic happens, until it's forced upon us, because otherwise we live with this kind of distant God in the sky approach. And we do this not just with religion, by the way. We do this. These cataclysmic events force memory upon us that otherwise is entirely out of sight, out of mind. How many in this room 6 months ago, 4 months ago, woke up every morning and within an hour or so were thinking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Unless you study this for a living, you weren't. None of us were. Was it there? Of course it was there. It's been there for decades. And yet this event happens. A cataclysmic event is forced upon us, and now we think about it. We think about it morning, day, and night. We pray for them. We long for this peace to come in this broken, horrific situation. And yet it was forced on us in a way that we weren't aware of previously. This happens in our personal lives as well. And I won't dwell on this, and I don't mean to shock with this either. This isn't like a, ha-ha, here's my moment. I almost died this summer. See? Genuinely. July 20th, I had a massive heart attack. I have zero history of heart disease. I thought I was having a panic attack, and I told my wife, stop bugging me, I feel fine. She forced me to go to the hospital. I had a full STEMI heart attack, almost died. Blood clot found its way conveniently into my heart. Thanks be to God, I can kind of joke about it now. I'm doing very well and have really recovered. They said if I had won my argument and not my wife, and I had stayed home and stayed in bed and gone to sleep, I wouldn't have woken up. You better believe the last 3 months, I am a part-time cardiologist. I'm a part-time optometrist. It's messed with my eyesight in a significant way. I am a part-time dietitian. All of these things forced on me, very unwelcome. It's been very inconvenient, I must add. A very bad day that day. And yet this is this kind of cataclysmic event. But here's the thing. Whether it's a personal event like that, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, these things are not sustainable. It's not a sustainable way of life, because a day will come when you and I wake up and we don't think about Israel. If we're being honest, a day will come, things will move along, and we won't think every day about Palestine. We won't think about the Ukrainian conflict. I won't think about my cardiologist. Even now, 3 months out, I think of it less than I did then. Things start to fade, and if our faith and our remembrance of God is similar to these cataclysmic events, then our life with God is entirely dependent on life's highest highs and lowest lows, and is not sustainable. And we do this in our religious life as well. We seek out those events, because sometimes we think they're for our good. And so we go on pilgrimage, or we visit a cathedral, and you hear a sermon from Father Jameson that moves you to the core of your being, and all of that is good. But if that's the whole of your spiritual life, it's not sustainable. And so you have to have another form of remembering God that's not simply cataclysmic. And this is what I'm calling, for lack of a better phrase, cultivated remembrance, a cultivated faith. This is where I want to spend the bulk of our time. And we do this as well in other parts of life. We cultivate things. And the thing with a cultivated memory is it isn't forced on us. It's usually an act of the will. We decide, I want to be or do something, and we set our intention towards it. We see an end goal. I see an aim down the road. I want to be that kind of person. And so what are the steps that need to be taken to get there? Think of our evening tonight. Unless you are the rare child who came out of the womb with remarkably sophisticated taste, none of us in this room liked wine when we were children, right? Give a child a glass of wine. Don't give them a glass of wine. Give a child a sip of wine, and what do? They go, oh, it's so gross. Oh, how do you drink that, Dad? That's what my kids say. Oh, it's terrible. Even communion at church, they're like, oh, this is so sour. And yet all of us one day woke up and said, sophisticated, refined people like wine. I'm going to like wine. That's a cultivated decision of the will that says, I'm going to be a person who likes wine and knows the difference in good wine and bad wine. And we set out on that end, and we make habits, and we form rhythms of life and being that lead us into that end. And I can tell you now with confidence, I know the difference every time between a red and a white. Every time. I don't miss it, because I cultivated it. I cultivated that refined palate of mine. I'll give you another example. And these are silly examples, but it helps you see a really valid point. I have an irrational love for Everton Football Club. Has anyone ever heard of Everton Football Club? God bless you. I'm sorry. No, they're not good. About 10 years ago, I decided I'd exhausted American sports. I needed something a little more pretentious, a little more refined, and so I looked to the English, as a good Anglican would, and said, I'm going to like English Premier League soccer. And so I needed a team. You don't just like a league, you need a team. And so I said, I'm going to love Everton. At the time, they had a goalie who was one of America's great goalies, a man named Tim Howard, who is the star of the World Cup at the time. They'd had more Americans play for them than any team in history. And on their grounds where they play their football, there's an Anglican parish literally built into their stadium. And at the time, working as an Anglican priest, I was like, I'm done. This is my team. And so it's a decision of the will where I then cultivated a love. I cultivated a love for this team that was non-existent. It was purely an act of my will that turned into a real affection. And irrationally so. I love this team. They've been nothing but awful to me. It is an abusive relationship. They have spent £600 million on players in the last 6 years and are facing bankruptcy. They're the worst soccer team ever. Don't love them. Like, whatever you do, don't look them up, don't Google them, just run away. But I love them. I love this team because I've cultivated that desire. My little son, who I showed you, is 9 years old. He loves cars. He's at that phase where kids love cars. And I want to say at least once a week, he asks me, Dad, if you could have any car in the world, what car would you get? And I've run out of accessible cars, and so now the answers are like, oh, I'd get a Bugatti, son. I'd get a Ferrari. And then, of course, the question is, well, son, what car would you get? Every time, without wavering, his answer is, Dad, I'd get a Ford Maverick. A Ford Maverick's the cheapest car sold in America. But at some point, he got in his head that a Ford Maverick's a good car, that Ford had just released an economic, small pickup truck. And for some reason, that captured his imagination. He said, all right, that's going to be my car. And so weekly, I have this conversation. Every time he sees one, he says, Dad, there's a Ford Maverick. I say, oh, wow, son, that's amazing. So he's set high goals for himself. I think this one could someday be achievable. But these are silly, but these are cultivated ways of shaping the things we love. And so it begs the question to then apply it to a life of prayer, to our spiritual life. What's the goal of the spiritual life? What's the end goal that we then need to cultivate and work our way towards? Would anyone be bold enough to venture an answer? What is the aim of the spiritual life? Heaven, relationship with God. We're off to a good start. Anything else? Okay. Jesus, peace, peace. So I'm not going to answer that, but I'm going to let someone else answer it. I'm going to introduce you to a group of Anglican clergy that wrestled with this question, and I think they did a profound job. In the 17th century, you find some of my favorite Anglicans, a group of clergy called the Caroline Divines, because they were living at the time of King Charles. And so the Caroline Divines took a lot of time to think through what is the end goal of the spiritual life, and how do I work towards it? How do I cultivate a way of life that actually sets me on a course to achieve that goal? Because those things have to go together. You have to have an aim, and you have to have the means by which you get there. And this is the thing I love about the Caroline Divines, is they show us both of these. Oh, there's my question. So, the thing that these guys taught in such a compelling way was they said, essentially, they looked out at the landscape of England in the 17th century, and they said, the problem that we see is people don't love the things they should love. They have disordered loves. The things were quite different in some ways than they are in our day, but that is a universal observation. In any given age, you can look and say, people don't love what they ought to love, or we don't love the things we think we love. We say we love God, but if you did an audit of the way I spend my money, the way I spend my time, the way I catch myself daydreaming throughout the day, those are better indicators of what I love than maybe what I just say. And so in our day, maybe we love the Atlanta Braves more than we love Christ, or the Savannah Bananas, or probably not the Savannah Bananas, no, or gardening, or Civil War history, whatever it may be. We all have things that we love, and those aren't inherently bad, but if there's a disorder to it, that has to be tended to. And these Caroline Divines, they were very helpful in helping us say that what you need to do is tend to the soil of the things that you love the most. whatever you love most deeply in the world will shape the kind of life that you live. It will shape the kind of person that you are and the kind of person you're becoming. And that's really important because otherwise you just hear someone like me or your priests or others, and all you hear is morality. It goes back to that Christian Smith idea that all God wants you to do is to shape up and to live by the rules and do a bunch of good things, and then he'll be happy with you. God didn't die. God didn't send Jesus, and he didn't die to make you good. He didn't die so that you would think deep things or have nice thoughts about God. Those aren't inherently bad, but we've inherited this overly scholastic approach in the West, this overly juridical idea that separates us from the things we love, and love being a means by which we stay in relationship. And that's the end. Someone said it, like the idea of staying in communion with God, in a lived, intimate relationship with the Lord, and love being the way in which that is sustained. And that's what these divines did so well. And so they said, let's read the early church fathers, especially the Eastern fathers. And this is of interest to me. They read many of the Eastern fathers and said, what we find over and over again is this incredible emphasis on relationship, on the way in which the life God calls us to live is so that we are made able to stay in communion with him. And so sin isn't breaking the rules. Sin isn't a legal infraction. Sin is a wound that keeps us from being in communion with the Almighty. It's a fundamentally different way of viewing this. An Anglican named Martin Thornton put it this way. With Aquinas, the Carolines stood firm on the teleological principle. The human end, again, that end goal, the human end is not moral goodness, but glory. Morals and ascetics are inseparable. Orthodox theologian Peter Buteneff put it this way: our vocation is to become by grace everything that Christ is by nature. In other words, our work is to participate in God's work and in his will, and in his light and his glory, to the point where, while remaining created human persons, we become also partakers of the characteristics of divinity itself. And if that sounds quite lofty, he's paraphrasing 2 Peter. This is a biblical vision of becoming by grace what Christ is by nature. Anything less than that is too small of a vision to give your life to, which is also why it's easy to let go of it and forget it, to forget God, because the vision of what we've said yes to is not all that compelling. And if it's anything less than this, it will be easy to move on. And so that's part of my encouragement, is to say, let's have the right end goal so that we order our lives towards that end. I'll give you one more quote from the divines by a man named Jeremy Taylor, who I love deeply. He says, therefore, our virtues have such proper objects that it is but reasonable they should all turn into love. For certain it is that this love will turn all into virtue. For in the scrutinies for righteousness and judgment, when it is inquired whether such a person be a good man or no, the meaning is not what does he believe or what does he hope, but what he loves. So, with that grounding, let's talk a bit about prayer. We're going to run out of time. Let's move along. I want to show you a couple of things. In the time we have left, let's talk a little about the Anglican rhythm of prayer. If it wasn't clear, these Caroline divines have helped us see the aim. The aim is glory. The aim is the glory of God, to be a full participant in the life of God. To do so, Anglicanism has for at least 400 years, in many ways longer than that, drawn on certain rhythms of prayer that they've said, if that's the aim, here's the means. Here's the way this is actually doable. And I want to look at that for a minute, and then highlight some challenges and opportunities in our own day for how we can actually live into that. So let's talk about a rule-based religion. It's intentionally tongue-in-cheek and a little provocative, because we all hate the idea of rules-based religion. Like, oh, no, not that. But a rule-based religion is what I'm actually highly advocating for tonight. But let me define what I mean by rule, a rule-based. Again, this man, Martin Thornton, says this: rule is the literal translation of the Latin word regula, which means rule, pattern, model, example, from which we derive the word regular as both noun and adjective. Rule, like pattern, model, or system, is an essentially singular word, in some ways directly opposite to a list of rules. And a regular Christian is one who lives to rule. So that's our aim, to be regular Christians who live by a rule, who live by a rhythm and a pattern of faith. But our pattern and rule needs to be two things. It needs to be predictable, and it needs to be sustainable. Those go together. Your life with God needs to be predictable, not in the stale sense we use that word, but to say, I know what I'm doing in my life with God. I know the things I've said yes to, and I'm going to stick with them. That's the sustainable part, predictable and sustainable, because the aim is to move away from that cataclysmic reactionary faith where my life is dormant with God, totally non-existent until crisis happens, and then it all kind of awakens. Instead, what if it's this even-keeled and steady approach? The Greek fathers called it nepsis. That was their word for it. Nepsis, which means sober joy. It's a beautiful word, nepsis, sober joy, which means your faith is not too high, but it's also not too low. It's this steady, even-keeled faith. And the older I get, the more I long for that kind of life with God, this nepsis, this steady faith. Let me tell you a little more about this man, Martin Thornton. He was a 20th century English priest, really cut from the same cloth as these Caroline divines in the 17th century, a remarkable man. And you can find anything on the internet. I went to look up Martin Thornton, and I found his tombstone in about 2 seconds. Here's a photo of it. It's very hard to see. It was a terrible photo. But again, like, there's his tombstone. Look at what's on it, though. This sums this man's life up in so many ways. It says, the word of God, his rule, the glory of God, his aim, and to God the Holy Trinity was all his guiding. Someone knew this man really well and summed his life up in a single phrase. But I love those first two especially. The word of God, his rule, the glory of God, his aim. Aim is where you want to be, and a rule is how you get there. That's maybe the clearest I could say what I'm trying to say tonight. The aim is where you want to be. The rule is how you get there. So then what is the Anglican rule of life? Quickly, I'll go through this because you have very competent leadership in this parish. You've probably taught you this many times in many different ways. So I just want to briefly speak to this. Thornton summed up the Anglican rule of prayer, and he called it a threefold rule. He said Anglicans at their best live a threefold rule where they have a regular rhythm of these three things: Eucharist, daily prayers, and it's daily office and private prayers. And I'll speak just briefly about each of these. So Eucharist, probably the most well-known to us, in the sense especially it's shared by all Christians, gave by the Lord Jesus himself. And so this is something we all likely are quite familiar with because it is the center of our life with Christ. It is the center of our gathered and communal life with God. It's where we receive and encounter the living presence of God. Though I don't agree with maybe the way they frame it, it is for good reason that Catholics call Sundays a day of obligation. They're trying to speak to the fact that this is not optional. This is not something that you can take or leave. This is the heart of our rule, our rhythm, and our pattern of life. And yet, it's only part of it. It's only part of it. And if it is the only one in which we give ourselves to, we will miss this abiding remembrance, this abiding life with God, which is where the daily offices come in. And there it's probably also helpful to define. When we hear office, we probably think of a room or a building. Go to the office, that sort of thing. Really, when we say daily office, we're thinking and talking about what do you do in that office, less the building itself. So this is the daily work of Christians. This is the daily stuff of faith. One of my favorite definitions of prayer comes from St. John Damascene, who says that prayer is the lifting up of the mind to God. The lifting up of the mind to God. And so in the daily office, what we're saying is we refuse to let that lifting up to God be simply something that happens one day a week. We want this to be a daily rhythm of life. And the genius of the Anglican way, especially the compilers of the prayer book, and I'm stepping a little into deeper waters where I probably should take a step back because this is significant stuff here. But I would just say this. What Thomas Cranmer and the other compilers did is they said, what's good for the monastic rhythms is good for the laity as well. If it's good for a monk, it's good for a midwife. And that was radical in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, you had a two-tiered path to holiness. You had those who were dedicated to the monastic life, and it was kind of the fast track, the golden path to holiness. Then everyone else had a few prayers they could pray, try and not get sick and die when you're young, and that's the best you can do. And Cranmer said, what if this rhythm, this ordered way of life could be observed by everyone in a nation. And that's what he did. He unified an entire nation around a set way of prayer. And so what he did, I can even show you this. I'll go quickly. He took the monastic prayer rhythms and worked basically as an editor, where he compiled and edited them down into what we have as morning prayer and evening prayer. Took 6th century habits of monastic life, these morning prayer, matins, lauds, prime, and turned that into morning prayer. Vespers, none, compline, turned those into evening prayer. And it became a shared rhythm. And the thing, and this is getting into the challenge as well, what you then had was you had these very domestic, idyllic settings in rural England, where if you're a farmer, after the Book of Common Prayer comes out, your parish every morning has morning prayer. And on your way out to the field, you stop in and you pray with your community. Order your day that way, go work your day, come back home on the way home for dinner, you then stop in, pray evening prayer, and then get on with your day. There's an incredible beauty to that rhythm, incredibly beautiful. And yet, it is a difficult one to sustain in the 21st century. Although I told Father Jameson this, if anyone's doing an admirable job, this is a pretty good attempt at it right here. Because we have this idyllic setting, this beautiful church, this walkable space. There are ways in which we hearken back where we are right now to this vision. And yet, if I were to poll the room, most of you tonight probably came from 30, 45 minutes radius all around. It's probably true on a Sunday, maybe more. And the idea that we all are this walkable, proximate community where we can have this rhythm of prayer at church is very difficult. It's not sustainable, especially where I live in Atlanta, where a 30-minute drive is like the shortest you can expect to go anywhere. It's not sustainable. And so we have to have other ways to have this value, to have this vision. Private prayers, I won't dwell here because I think this is the one we get the most. Especially, I grew up evangelical, and the evangelical church does this really well. This idea that you have a personal life with God, that God speaks to you, that you know him in real and intimate and personal ways. That's a beautiful thing. And I'll leave it at there. Because what Thornton does, this is a very uninspiring fence, but it's all Google would give me. Thornton says this threefold rule is like a fence. And he says Eucharist is like the corner post that gives shape and definition to a fence. And then the daily office, he says, is like a post maybe every 10 feet down the way. It's like the structure. And then he says your personal prayers are like a lattice work that provides the beauty and the ornateness to this fence. And he says all of those together create what we would call a structurally sound and beautiful fence.